Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for standing by. Welcome to the webinar today, brought to you by Comply Right. Independent contractor or employee, how to get it right every time and protect your business from devastating penalties. Please note that during the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. My name is Stephanie Thomas and I am your host. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar and welcome. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items. If you'd like to ask a question, simply use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. Our speaker will try to answer a few questions at the end of the presentation if time allows. If you have any audio trouble, please message us in the chat box and we will assist you. Finally, please ensure your speakers are turned on with the volume up. Now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today, Marcia Miller. She is the president and owner of Financial Horizons, and she is commonly referred to as the 1099 Queen and has a lot of information to share about 1099s and reporting. She's worked on accounting, tax, and management consulting with emphasis on representing small business owners for over 35 years and has been a live speaker for various national companies and accounting organizations, in addition to being an author. And finally, she has been appointed for a 3-year term to the Internal Revenue Service's Information Reporting Program Advisory Committee, and she has a lot to share about that as well. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Marcia Miller. Take it away, Marcia. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Stephanie, and it's a pleasure to be with everybody today. We've got a fact-filled webinar today. We're talking about the independent contractor status. And I actually call it the battle between a W-2 and a 1099. And you'll see why when we go through some of the rules here. Now with 1099 information, I'm sorry, the slide didn't go. With the information and the regulations we have and being enforced, in other words, by enforcing, there are a lot of penalties that are assessed, and it gives Treasury another way of getting money in to decrease some of our deficits. And so the good thing about you being on the call today, all of you are doing something proactively to learn about all these rules so you or your companies will not be penalized. And you have to understand penalties can mount up for all non-compliance or even a mere error. We're going to be reminded by the government's lack of resources due in part to the budget shortcomings, you hear about that every day in the news, and the ever-increasing tax gap. For those of you who are not accountants like I am, maybe you're not aware that the tax gap is that difference between the amount of federal tax owed and the amount that's voluntarily paid in on time. And so we have audits increasing because the government wants to bring in these fines and penalty amounts to offset their other revenue losses. So I just wanted you to have that background of what's going on. Now let's look at the independent contractors themselves. What is an independent contractor? Well, those are the parties that are doing a job for you who are under your control. Very important that you know about the control issue. And they are distinguished between the employees that you have on W-2s, which account to you every day. Maybe it's a time report. Maybe it's a time clock. They come to work every day to work for you, and you call the shots. An independent contractor can work for other parties, and they call the shots. So it's very, very different. When we talk about independent contractors, in a lot of cases, and the most famous one is the Microsoft case, where they refer to these independent contractors as freelancers. And by the way, if you're really interested in it, there is actually a website for just freelancers. It's very interesting. Go Google it, and you'll be surprised at what you will find out about these freelancers. And just to briefly tell you about the Microsoft case, what happened there and a lot of you on the call today, I'm sure, are in payables, so you'll understand this. What happened in that landmark case is Microsoft hired engineers right alongside their normal employees. However, the employees put their hours on, maybe it's a time clock, gave it to the payroll or human resources people, and the other workers who claimed to be 1099 workers said that they were in business for themselves and they would submit a bill to the accounts payable department. It was a massive court case and penalties that were assessed against Microsoft because they called the other people freelancers. You can't be a freelancer and work alongside a normal employee, the employee who gets benefits, the employee that you take taxes out of, the employee that you give stock options. And let's think back to Microsoft when this case started. That was the start of Windows. Would you like to be classified as an independent contractor, doing the same as the employees, and yet you don't have those options? So there's a lot of landmark cases out there that we can look at. And because of that, we know what we should do in the future. Now, there's two polls I'm going to ask you for here. This is going to be the first of them. And in this poll, I'm going to ask you, do you currently use independent contractors to help run your business? And you have two choices, either yes or no. And we'll see what the percentage is. Now keep in mind that when we're talking about those parties who receive 1099s, and that's 1099 miscellaneous because there's 30 some odd 1099s that are out there, those recipients can include actors, artists, novelists, freelance writers, and similar creative artists. It's not just the workers who are in your plant or your offices. There's a lot of different classifications. And in today's economy, and in an attempt to control employers' costs, many businesses have increased the hiring of various independent contractors to work on particular tasks. If structured properly, the employer can cease the working relationship and merely issue a 1099 miscellaneous, but it has to be structured in a certain way. Otherwise, it's extremely costly. And it looks like 70% of our audience today are currently using independent contractors. So that is why this is such a timely thing to talk about, because of our audience here. Now, I did mention the Microsoft case, and I will tell you that both Microsoft and Federal Express have been labeled as the poster children of 1099 misclassification class actions. So for those of you who are hiring independent contractors or think they're independent, perhaps you should look at some of those cases. Let's face it, if they had the money to hire the best attorneys in the country and they lost in court, and by the way, the FedEx case was going on for 10 years and it's still going on, then you as a small business owner or perhaps the company you work for should look at their arguments and what you want to do in the future. Now, when we have independent contractors, yes, we're going to save money. It's going to offer a lot of our people flexibility, although a lot of employees today are getting flex time. And in fact, there are a lot of employees, even in our government, they're actually getting the right to work at home every other Friday. This is something that's become popular today, but just because they're working off-site does not mean they're independent. They may still have that employee status because the company that has employed them has control over them. In other words, They tell them what they should do, when they should do it, how they should do the job, unlike the independent contractor who knows his skill or her skill and is doing it outside of the normal employees. Now, of course, we know we can save money, the benefits, the taxes, and whatnot. But should you happen to misclassify your contractor, some of the penalties are double what you would have to pay. The Social Security, the withholding rates, giving back the benefits. You may not want to do that. Now, when you use independent contractors, which a lot of businesses are doing today, understand that it's not a legitimate way to avoid complying with labor and tax laws. And I will tell you, over the course of the last few years, both the IRS and the Department of Labor are working as partners to combat the misclassification of workers. Why? Because the states and the federal government both need those revenues into the system. Let me give you an example. Perhaps most of you on the call here today get a W-2. In that W-2, it states how much Social Security, Medicare tax, and withholding was deducted from your pay, and then it's paid in on time into the government. If you're an independent contractor or you're paying an independent contractor, they get the 1099 miscellaneous. In most cases, there is no withholding and certainly no Social Security or Medicare taxes. So if that contractor does not file their taxes timely or does not pay in estimated payments, it's possible the government's going to have a shortfall as those taxes have not been paid in the same way the W-2 taxes are paid in, which is normally on a biweekly or a monthly schedule. So you can see this could add to the tax gap as well. There are some ideas in Congress. They're saying maybe all the 1099s should be subject to Medicare and Social Security taxes, because if they were, that would help us not have a problem or shortfall in the Social Security pool of funds to give all the recipients later on. Of course, if the independent contractor has a lot of itemized deductions, they'll wind up getting back that excess Social Security paid in. But that's something the government is looking at now, because most independent contractors are not paying in taxes. Of course, they could on a quarterly estimate, but most of them don't. Now, I mentioned that we have the partnership between the federal and state agencies. The biggest one is the IRS and the Department of Labor. They've been working, you hear it on the news every day that a lot of our states are in more financial ruins than even the IRS or our Treasury is. So they're all working together. And then we have other state agencies, of course, that are, you have not only the IRS who's involved in the tax collection process, but you have the Department of Labor who's out there to protect the employer's rights. OSHA is known for safety. If you're an independent contractor, you're not going to have these rights. They're not there for you. But there could be a reason why you are indeed an independent contractor. Now, I mentioned that the penalties can double if you misclassify someone. And also some of the taxes, we talked about Social Security, Medicare, and the penalties. Perhaps there's going to be back wages that you were supposed to get. We all know now there's a new overtime law out there. Well, if you've misclassified your employees as independent contractors, and now the IRS reclassifies them as employees, what could happen is you'll have to pay back wages and maybe overtime. Because think about this. If you have an independent contractor, you're not paying them by the hour. You're paying them by the job. Another important thing to look at, you may have to pay back premiums for workman's comp insurance for as long as the relationship existed between the worker and the employer. This can be very costly. And let me tell you what could happen if you have an independent contractor working at your offices or your factory. They get hurt on the job and they say, all I do is work for this company 5 days a week, a 40-hour week. They tell me what time I have to be there. Obviously, you are an employee. But were you on their workman's comp insurance? No, because you're an independent contractor and being paid as such. And so if you get hurt on the job, the company has not put you on their insurance plan, and that can be very costly to the employer. So that's something else you want to look at. And if we have somebody who gets hurt, very often it will trigger these audits that are out there. Now, should you be a person who is working for someone and you know that you're working along side by side with employees but you are being paid on a 1099, you have a right to request of the IRS a determination letter, and you would file a Form SS-8. And by the way, not only can you file it, but the employer themselves, if they think that they've misclassified workers, they can use this SS-8 to get that determination letter from the government. So that's something you want to look at. And there's also an amnesty program that's out there, the voluntary compliance program that allows you to come clean and say, look, I misclassified all my workers all these years. Can I come clean with just a small penalty and I won't do it anymore, and you won't go back and audit me for the previous years? That's something that's out there now. It's been out there for about the last 4 years. And it was originally an amnesty program that was going to be temporary, and now it looks like it's going to be permanent. So know that you have that option also. Now, we are going to see a lot of workers being paid as independent contractors. I mean, years ago everyone said the American dream was to own your own home. Well, now they're saying the American dream is to own your own business. If it truly is your business, if you have your own insurance and employees that you pay, if you have agreements with the companies that you're doing work for, you can be an independent contractor. Make sure those agreements are sound, because there are a lot of legal agreements for independent contractors that are written up and they're not foolproof. So I have to stress that just having a mere agreement will not mean that you're going to have a free ride. Now, the IRS has given us several different classifications and tests that are out there. For years, and actually this was under a revenue ruling from 1987, they have what they call the 20-factor test. And those 20 factors would decide whether or not you have an employee versus an independent contractor. Most of those factors related to control. And what the IRS has done in the last few years, and the DOL has done this as well, is they've simplified those 20 factors. And now what they have is three major factors, and that's to determine whether there's behavioral control, financial control, or the type of relationship or the relationship between the parties. Those three things are the most important elements of control. And when you look at each one of them, they actually are a group of the 20 factors. For example, behavioral control will say, is there training involved? I'm trained myself to talk about taxes and whatnot. I don't need someone to train me that way. If they did, then I wouldn't be independent. I'd be an employee. So you have to look, and financial control, the biggest one is, can the party make a profit from what they're doing in business? Let's face it, if you work for somebody, if they lose, let's say they have a bad month in their business, they still have to make payroll. You don't share in the finance, in the problems. Of course, when they make a profit, you don't share in that either. And that's what financial control of. And the relationship of the parties is to prove whether or not you are independent, that the employer has no control over the worker. So these are some things you want to look at. And this has taken over for the 20-factor test. Now there's also another test that's out there, and here's just some of the examples of those three tests, and I think I gave you the top ones. Here's another test. It's called the economic reality test. And we're seeing that the Department of Labor, a lot of states are using this. And what they've done, again, it all started from that 20-factor test. They've broken it down now to 6 factors. I like what we have in the modernized 20-factor test. And by the way, those 3 elements, behavioral, financial, the relationship of the parties, are all questioned on the 4 or 5 pages of that SF8 I told you about, where you can determine status of your workers. So that's used by most people, but I think we're seeing more states using the economic reality test. And in that, here's the factors. Right to control. Does the worker control how the work may be done? Investment. Well, if you own your own company, obviously you're going to have your own tools, your equipment. Most of the time when you work for a company, they supply it. What is the length of the relationship? Now let's face it, if you go to work for someone, do they tell you, I'm hiring you for the next 20 days, and then I won't need you anymore? No, normally you're hired, and if your work is good, and if they can afford to keep you, I know there are layoffs, you could stay there forever. You could be part of their retirement plan. In the case of an independent contractor, the length of relationship is not stated. It's a contract to perform a task perhaps within a certain amount of time, and once that task is gone, they go on to the next job that they have. They could be running 10 different jobs at once. So it's very different, the types of relationship and the timing of it as well. Skill, I talked about skills, licenses. Level of risk, we talked about that. Do you share in the loss of your employer? No. And the level of integration, that's the extent to which the workers' services are such a big part of the employer's businesses. So you've got these two tests that are extremely important today. Okay, as you see, the next slide says, are you confused? You shouldn't be confused. Just know what the rules are, and at least you won't be subject to all those penalties. So let's go on a little more. And we're going to start with a poll again. And this poll says, which of the following documents is most important in order to validate the contractor status? Your choices are the invoice from a contractor, Form 1099, Form W-9, or an agreement. And if you will answer that, and then I'll share the results with everybody. As you're doing that, I have to tell you that worker classification is such a hotly contested audit issue. I mean, we've got so many, you hear in the news with the Uber drivers, Google has their share of it. Can you imagine there's still major companies that are out there, public companies, that are fighting this battle. Whether that worker is classified as the employee or as an independent contractor can mean a substantial difference in the amount of employment taxes that that business has to pay. And as the stories that we're seeing in the press today, an incorrect classification can lead to penalties, interest, tax liens that could cripple an otherwise successful business. So that's why you have to know about this. And it looks like 55% of you believe that it is the agreement that validates the contractor status. Now I just want to go over some of the things that are listed here. A mere invoice from a contractor does not mean we've got independent contractors. Go back to the Microsoft case where I told you they gave invoices and were paid by the accounts payable department. The Form 1099 doesn't say that we have a contractor. All it is reporting how much you gave, what was the monetary value given to the workers. And it's reported on 1099, and then the worker is supposed to report it on their income tax returns annually. The W-9 is merely a request for, yes, a lot of 1099 people have to fill this out, unlike the employee who has to fill out a W-4 for the payroll department. But the mere filling out of the W-9 does not mean we have a valid contractor status. And as far as the agreement is concerned, going back to the Microsoft case, they had an agreement, they made some mistakes in it. Today our large, high-profile labor attorneys know what should be in the agreement so that it will stand up if questioned later on. So that explains that one, and we're going to go on a little more. Now, we have to look at how you're going to protect yourself. If you're going to have an independent contractor, make sure that it has payment amounts and terms. Make sure there's a specific end date. The contractor has their own tools to be responsible for, and they can offer their services to anybody else out there. I want to go a step further. I hadn't mentioned this in the beginning. We know that we have a lot of people who are true independent contractors. We also know that perhaps they worked for that same company prior as an employee. I want you to know that the IRS has hosted forums on proper worker classification. In fact, there's one that's coming up next week. And they're warning it's an automatic red flag should an employer issue both a W-2 and a 1099 to the same individual with the same Social Security number. The IRS matching program is getting better, and they are specifically looking for this because let's say a company was on hard times and they determine, okay, I'll just put this particular worker on a 1099, I'll call them an independent contractor, I'm going to save all the benefits, I'm going to save on the taxes. This is very common today. But with that matching program, the IRS sort of has a hint of what's going to happen. Now, I also want to mention to you, I mentioned that the Department of Labor is changing and it's to the benefit of those parties that are W-2 employees. They're changing the rules for overtime pay, and they will be effective the end of this year. And also with that comes a requirement for all companies or U.S. employers, we're talking about now, to update their mandatory postings. It's really important today that you timely classify these independent contractors correctly because these new Department of Labor rules and postings that were just released last week, which was, I believe it was July 27th, includes bullet points about correctly classifying workers. And employees of yours may start asking a lot of questions. An employer can stay protected if they post these posters. I know years ago I used to give as a present at the end of the year to all my clients a labor law posting because you're supposed to have it at every place of work. Well, now if you want to keep in compliance, you can go and get Poster Guard from Comply Right, and you can post that there. In case someone comes in, you want to be able to display that. And you want whoever's there for whatever audit to know that you're abiding by the most recent laws that are out there. Now, in talking about how to protect yourself, the first thing, don't let the worker tell you whether they're an independent contractor or not. Again, you got to go back to the element of control. They might want to be classified as an independent contractor merely so they'll have more spending money every week. And maybe they never intend to file a tax return and pay the taxes. Believe it or not, there are a lot of people out there who are behind in filing their taxes and, of course, behind in paying in taxes, again, adding to that tax gap I started out with before. Now, if you have an independent contractor, make sure you don't use words like hourly salary. You're paying them for each task they're doing or job they're doing. And perhaps they're paying workers. You don't want to pay them out of your payroll department, not your HR. You want to do it out of accounts payable. And you're not going to withhold taxes or issue a W-2. Now, I mentioned there are cases where you may have a person who was your W-2 employee and now they're a former employee. Perhaps you're going to pay them a 1099. Just be careful that you don't issue that 1099 in the same year you issued the W-2. Perhaps there's a reason for it, but you're going to get a nasty grant from the IRS. Do you want to have that? Don't use an independent contractor full-time. They're not a full-time, quote-unquote, employee. You want to just hire them for whatever the contract states they're supposed to do for you. Some of the things you want to do is you want to choose, you want to choose the independent contractors who have the skills, the expertise to work independently without training and supervision. If you go and look up the 20 factors, number 1 and 2. Number 1 is training, who provided the training, and number 2 is supervision. Okay? You want to treat these independent contractors as a vendor for your accounts payable department. You don't want to make the mistake, though, that Microsoft made. This is truly an independent contractor, independent of what you have your daily employees do. And you want to be consistent with workers who perform similar duties. I mentioned before that you could file an SS-8, which is a determination of your status of whether you should be called an employee or an independent contractor. And it's 5 pages of questions, but as you answer the question, you'll know whether you're an employee or not. When you fill that out, it's possible. One of the reasons and it'll ask why you're doing this. One of the reasons might be that you're working with people who you know were misclassified, performing similar services at that company, and they got a determination letter that they are indeed employees. And that could be a reason for you filing that SS-8. Now, some other things to protect yourself. Normally, your independent contractors are going to have a business name. Even if it's their name, and there are a lot of people that, like I could have Marsha Miller PA, or I could just have Marsha Miller as an independent contractor and file a Schedule C. But whether I'm a Schedule C taxpayer or an 1120, that's corporate taxpayer or partnership, whatever it may be, I'm probably going to have a separate employee identification number. That's something you normally see. Also, as an independent contractor that you hire, you're not their only client. They have other clients that are out there. You always want to write checks to the business name. I recently had some construction done, and the contractor said, write it out to me personally. Well, his personal name was nothing like the name of his company, for which I had an insurance certificate for to work in my house. And obviously, if I were to just write the check to him, he's going to take it to a local check cashing store. He's probably not going to count it as income. And also, we want to make sure that individuals are there with a valid business. So you want to write the checks to the business name. That's usually the best thing to do, even though we have people who want to skirt the issue. And don't forget, if you pay someone and they don't give you the right information, you're actually helping them to defraud the government if you haven't given them the right classification and not give them a 1099 at the end of the year. When in doubt, you can always treat the worker as an employee. Yes, you'll have to give the benefits. Yes, you'll have to pay the taxes. But until you get that determination letter, you may want to do this. You know, there are so many companies out there who are going to just have financial ruin because they didn't know the rules. And you know what? If they were that unsure, they really should have had them as an employee. And then, of course, you, as the worker, also want to know that you have the right status, that if you're entitled to certain benefits, that they're given to you. And that's why this is so important to be looking at. Now, at this point, although we're going to plan to address several of the issues that you may have regarding workers within your own company, or perhaps you yourself are an independent contractor or an employee, and you want to know how you should handle this, how you should approach your worker, or how you should approach your employer. So we're going to take some of those questions, but I have to tell you, for this section of what we're going to talk about, should you happen to have a specific scenario, and I've taught this subject for so many years, I know a lot of people will give me a question that actually takes 10 minutes to actually read the question. I don't want to hear those questions. I just want to hear the basic ones. But if you have something that has a fact pattern to it, I'm going to advise you to contact the Internal Revenue Service directly. Obtain your answer and document always. I tell everybody, document, document, document. The most important thing to do. Find out who you talk to, the time you talk to them, and the date of your inquiry. That's going to protect your company from having a documented source at the IRS who's given you their understanding of the situation, since the regulations sometimes require interpretation. And if you happen to get an audit, I have to tell you something. The results of the audit will be most dependent on the auditor. It's how they view the particular situation. And I want to share with you a phone number should you have a specific scenario, and that's 866-455-7438. Again, that's 866-455-7438. And that's the IRS number that you can call and give this scenario. You may want to fill out that SSA before you make that phone call to see what the case is that you have there. Excuse me. So at this point, I think it would be great if we open up to some questions.
Yes, thank you, Marcia. We have a couple questions rolling in, and we'll try to answer as many as we can right now. And the first question, I'll get started. Do independent contractors have to be paid overtime?
Because of the nature and the scope of their employment under the employer, if it takes them longer to do a task, that's their issue. There is no overtime rules that protect the independent contractor. I'll give you an example. Let's say the contractor. I'll give you a great example. The contractor who came here, one of his workers made such a bad mistake that they had to stay here till 8 o'clock at night to fix that problem. I didn't have to pay extra for it. Now, of course, the contractor had to pay his employee extra, but I didn't have to pay my contractor, who's the independent contractor, who would get a 1099 if I was paying him for my business. There's no overtime rule that's going to be in that relationship. Another question?
The next question here, can independent contractors get unemployment insurance or workers' comp?
I think we covered workman's comp before. As I stated, a lot of times an audit comes into a business because somebody has gone to an insurance company or gone to a feisty attorney to sue the employer where they got hurt. And then the first thing you're going to find out is, oh, but you're an independent contractor. The only protection you have is if you are an employee. Well, what happens in cases like that is perhaps the person who got injured, who's misclassified, can still sue the employer, but the employer has no insurance. As far as the unemployment insurance, again, this is something that you as an independent contractor are not, you will not have that. What happens in a lot of cases also, I remember years ago, when you have those long lines at the unemployment offices, the first thing the agent will say, who'd you work for before? And if they find out, and they'll ask the questions, because again, the state wanted all these revenues. If they find out that you actually worked for an employer and that employer had control, remember that word control, over you, then they're going to have another issue with the employer. You won't get the unemployment benefits, but you may from the state, but you may get them from the employer who misclassified you. Stephanie, another question?
Okay. We touched on agreements. Let's clarify, is an agreement enough to classify a worker as an independent contractor?
There's pros and cons to this. Certainly, I would advise anyone to have an agreement, but know that they can be challenged in court. So there are specific labor attorneys out there that know the challenges, and they'll make sure with the situation you have that you are protected, that you truly have an independent contractor agreement. But you want to make sure, I wouldn't get a canned one that's on the internet. I would go to a particular attorney. And again, you know, I didn't mention this before. Every state has their own regulations. You may want to see what the ruling is like in your particular state of residence or where you're working. Next.
Speaking of state rules, the question is, if I determine that a worker is an independent contractor under federal IRS rules, does that also mean that state income taxes do not have to be withheld also?
Again, every state is different. I'm in the state of Florida. We don't have a state income tax. There are a few states that still don't have it. But I do, if you look at the 1099, even though you're an independent contractor, there's a box there at the bottom for state income tax. And there may possibly be deductions. But again, it depends on the state whether you have to deduct. In those states with state income tax, they will force you to take a deduction from the worker's pay if they're an employee. As far as an independent contractor, again, that's up to the various states.
Okay. You touched on some of these. Do federal income taxes have to be withheld from independent contractor earnings?
No, they do not. And as I mentioned, one of the things the IRS is looking at is whether or not they should at least deduct the Social Security and Medicare taxes. So that'll help our system with the Social Security benefit shortfall that we have right now. By the way, I don't think it's ever going to go under. They're going to find a way to fund Social Security for all of us who want to retire one day. But let me tell you something else in regards to that. There is a box number 4 on every 1099 miscellaneous, and it says federal tax withholding. You can be an independent contractor and go to your employer and say, I would like you to deduct on my behalf 20%. Maybe I'm not disciplined enough to pay the quarterly payments. So I can ask you, as the party who's making the payments, deduct this on my behalf, and then at the end of the year, I'll see in box 4 the total that you deducted for the course of the year. There's another time where you'll see withholdings in that box, and actually 2 times. Perhaps you got a letter from the IRS. It's called a B notice. A B notice is a backup withholding notice. Perhaps you as the person, the payee, did not have the right ID number for that worker, for that independent contractor, and we're not talking about whether you were right or wrong, but you did give that party a 1099 and you had the incorrect number. The number didn't match with the name on that 1099. In a case like that, the IRS may send you the penalty notice, or it's called a 2100, and on there it's also going to say you have to withhold a certain amount until you get the right information. That's the B notice. And so you may see withholding on there. There's another instance where you may see a withholding of taxes, and that's actually called a C notice. And a C notice is that amount that was underreported and paid to the IRS. Give you an example. I don't care what state you're in, you know that all states have what they call the deadbeat dad or deadbeat mom rule, where the parent may have a lien against their wages for child support. Well, what the IRS has done with that C notice is they're saying to you as the employer or payor, that when you give any money to this particular payee, you have to deduct X amount of dollars per check that you give to that party. In that case, with the C notice, you can't stop the withholding until the IRS says that debt to them has been satisfied. So again, think of it just like the rules you have from the state or the county for child support. And those are the instances where you will see the withholding of taxes.
And I just want to confirm, we got a couple questions. Are you saying a C notice like the letter C?
Letter C, yeah. You either get a B notice, a backup withholding notice, but the C is where you have a debt to the IRS. The B notice it just means there was a mistake and we want you to withhold. The C notice means you owe the IRS. And you're, in effect, the IRS is making you their collection agent. So that's where the difference is.
How does the IRS know to notify you of the C notice? We're getting a lot of questions about the C notice.
You will get, the notice will be on a 2100, and it'll say on there, it will specify what you have to do as the payor to this particular person. Now let's say you have a true independent contractor. You had the right agreement and everything. This is not whether they're independent or they're W-2. This is the government is saying to the payor that the person that you're paying weekly, monthly, or on your contract, so to speak, owes us money. We want you to collect on our behalf, and it gets paid in during the same schedule your employee taxes are paid in. And then at the end of the year, you file what's called a 945, which is a recap of all the withholding on all the 1099s. Those of you on the call who are in payroll, you're familiar with the quarterly reporting filings on a 941, but when you're withholding from somebody's gross wages, not an employee, independent contractors, that those withholdings are paid on an annual form, which is called a 945.
Okay, thank you. That started to provide some clarity, but we just got a lot of questions about all of those forms. I'm going to ask one more question. For an independent contractor, our audience wants to know, do you have to give them an I-9 form?
The I-9 was put in, the answer is no. the I-9 was put into place years ago because we had a lot of illegal immigrants here who were trying to get a job, and on the I-9 it asks that you get, as the employer, certain verified information, a copy of their passport. You have to give 2 or 3 forms of information, identification, and place it in an employee file in your office. Normally, when you hire someone, you're going to get a W-4. That's so you know how many exemptions and how much money you should deduct from the various employees' pay. And you're going to get the I-9. And now there's a new form, and I'm seeing it in every single state. That's for each state's unemployment, and also that's who controls it. And it also guarantees when you hire an employee that they do not owe anything to any children. The states are working with the Child Support Services. So those 3, and that has to be faxed in to your state's unemployment division, and they handle that. So those 3 things are usually part of it. The only thing you'll get from an independent contractor normally is the W-9, which gives the name of the company, gives the correct ID number, and many times that W-9 will have to be signed, or it's called certified. And the times that you need a signature is if you ever got one of those B notices I spoke to a moment ago, you must get that payee to sign, that they certify that those items on that W-9 are true and correct. If you didn't have the B notice and you just hired a contractor and you got the W-9, it could be sent to you by email, by fax. You could get the information even over the phone. But if you get that B notice or that 2100 number that's in the corner of that notice, that's when you need them to sign that. And I think that's all the time we have for questions. I really appreciate you listening to me, and on behalf of both myself and Comply Right, we look forward to you joining us for further updates on the topics we discussed here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcia, for your time today. And before we sign off, I would like to remind everyone you will receive a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides and a follow-up email after the presentation. So please look out in your email inboxes for this material. And you can also visit www.complyright.com/webinars starting tomorrow to see this presentation. It will be in the tax reporting category at the bottom of your screen. So this will be live on complyright.com tomorrow for you to watch again, or share this presentation with others that you work with. If you realize today that you do work with independent contractors, you must report their annual pay for the work contracted. When the time rolls around to file 1099s in January, I want to remind you that you can get all-inclusive print, mail, and e-file services quickly, efficiently, and securely with efileforbiz.com. More information about this will be available in your follow-up email. And as Marcia mentioned, the Department of Labor is requiring and has required all U.S. employers to update their federal posters by August 1st, 2016, and that date has already passed. So to learn more about the posting change and the Poster Guard compliance protection, you can visit www.postertracker.com. Now finally, I would like to invite all of you to attend our next webinar on September 15th. It covers the FLSA overtime rule. It's called Ready, Set, Go, Critical Actions Every Employer Should Take with the new FLSA overtime rule. Understanding the new FLSA overtime rule is one thing, but knowing which changes to make in your business is another matter altogether. What are your rights under the FLSA? What are your responsibilities with overtime pay? And how can you ease the transition for affected employees so your business continues to run smoothly? Now is the time to cut through the confusion surrounding the new overtime rule, particularly what you can and can't do with employees. This free, insightful webinar will help you weigh your legal options and, just as important, develop a sensible implementation plan. We do have one webinar that we recorded in May and June with Ashley Kaplan, and this is a follow-up to that earlier webinar. And you can prepare to, before this webinar, get an overview of the overtime rule by visiting complyrate.com/webinars to watch that webinar first, and that webinar is called DOL Announces New Overtime Rules, What You Need to Know and Do to Comply. This was an informative session today, and I thank all of you for staying on with us for the full hour. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.